Thank you very much. I'm going to stick to my prepared remarks because I could talk about this subject for so long. And I know when you're coming up on the lunch hour, time is important. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm delighted to get to talk about Eliza Harriot O'Connor here. She believed that women would reach the college and the political forum, and her lectures influenced the Constitution's gender-neutral language, and she is an example of women who believed in education as a political right, and I was thinking so much of her at this morning's program. I always begin with her words, the epigraph of my book. The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for literary fame. And she meant people that people would think worthy of writing about. And I have a picture book approach to my slides because I'm a restless listener. 1 slide per minute, so no one's going to fall asleep. Eliza Harriot's been largely unknown. There's only 5 extant letters. 4 of those are to George Washington. 1 is to Benjamin Franklin's daughter. That letter is owned by and here at the APS. It's the most important of the 5 letters. It tells us that Sarah attended Eliza Harriot's important lectures in the summer of 1787 and knew and probably supported her ambitious plan for female education. Now, I met Eliza Harriot in an entry in George Washington's diary of May 1787. Washington was in Philadelphia waiting for the convention to start, the Constitutional Convention, and he had been at tea at Robert Morris's house. And then he went with Robert Morris's spouse, Mary White Morris, and other ladies to hear a lady read at the College Hall. He later rewrote his diary and explained the reading had been a charity affair, because the lady, being reduced in circumstances, had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. He said her performance was tolerable. And lest one misunderstand that, that is, of course, what Mr. Darcy says just a few years later to Eliza Bennet. And so I personally judge it a relative success. This lady was Eliza Harriot Barons O'Connor, who called herself Eliza Harriot. Now, when we think about the framing of the Constitution, we tend to think about the classic images of the framers, all about the men inside the room. And Jefferson described them perhaps somewhat ironically as demigods. And there are no demigoddesses here. But Cleo, the muse of history, was a demigoddess. She was the daughter of Zeus and Mnemosyne, the titan of memory. And Cleo provided inspiration for female artists, often the first ones to join male professional societies. And Cleo reminds us that history creates power by selecting what we remember about the past. And I think we have misremembered the space around the framing of the Constitution. It was a framing generation that transformed a monarchical constitution to a free one based on the people. And the framing generation, the we the people outside of Independence Hall, influenced the way in which the Constitution as a system was imagined and drafted. And I've written about, for example, 4 Native Nation representatives who met with Washington and convention delegates prominently in the summer of 1787 and influenced the drafting. And you can see here the APS building in the picture on the right. And also about John Adams, who was in England during the convention, but here every Friday in the summer through the newspaper serialization of his works on the Constitution. And the image here is of the September 21st, the first public publication of the preamble, which is down there at the bottom of Adams's publication. Now, we have no images of Eliza Harriot, but perhaps she resembled her cousin, Catherine Hardy, who's on the slide. She was born in Lisbon, grew up in England, a member of the aspiring gentry, educated at a female boarding school. Her grandfather and uncles both had been admirals, and her uncle served as governor of New York and New Jersey. In 1776, she married John O'Connor, an Irish law student at the Inner Temple. He appeared to be a gentleman, albeit quite impoverished, with unverified hints of connections to the ancient Irish royal families. They came of age in the 1770s and 1780s. What I've written is the age of the Constitution. People were rethinking assumptions about who should participate in the state. As far back as Aristotle, the Western intellectual tradition had embraced an ideology of female inferiority. For example, influential educational theorist Rousseau explained, the whole education of women ought to be relative to men. And then he added, reader, I appeal to you, be sincere. Which would you esteem the most? A woman who you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex, in her domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette, surrounded with pamphlets, political pamphlets of all sorts. A radical new idea arose in the English-speaking world, female genius, which signified that women had equal capacity, deserved equal education, and political representation. And there's many images of this in this period. Here's a few examples. The 9 Muses of Britain are painted showing contemporary female geniuses. The great African-American poet Phyllis Wheatley gained recognition, literally described in a poem as a female genius. And Catherine Macaulay, the great English constitutional historian, the first constitutional historian, is painted wearing the purple Roman senatorial sash. And so I always kind of vibe with her wearing purple when I give this talk. In London, female debating societies debated female representation. For example, in the newspaper, the debating call, ought not the women of Great Britain have a voice in the election of representatives and be eligible to sit in Parliament as well as men? And the Duchess of Devonshire became well known for her political activities. In 1786, Eliza Harriot and John moved to New York, the capital of the United States, and began an 8-year journey lecturing and opening female academies. In New York, her ambitious school emphasized the art of reading, what we would think of as public speaking, French, history, math, writing, and needlework. Her female school's extraordinary public exams were held at Columbia College with the participation of the Columbia professors, and then to make sure everybody knew, she wrote about it in the newspaper. But although she was very successful in New York, John's career decisions altered hers as they would for her entire life, and they moved to Philadelphia, where a convention was meeting to revise the existing federal constitution. So as constitutional convention's delegates gathered in the spring of 1787, Eliza Harriot gave the first public lecture by a woman in the United States. Between April and late August of 1787, in every Philadelphia newspaper, almost every day, her ads appeared for a course of lectures at the university. Lectures in the university by a lady. She gave her lectures in University Hall, which was over at 4th and Arch, the location of many male lecturers, including for the APS, whose building had not yet been built. Her lectures promoted belles lettres rhetoric, considered the foundation for professions like politics and law. She read Milton, Shakespeare, Pope, and then important political reformers, James Thompson, Edward Young, William Shenstone, along with the influential lawyer, political reformer, and Orientalist William Jones. She always included the work of the most famous woman writer of the time, Madame de Genlis, the first woman to teach the French royal children, and she delivered the most important political speech, Demosthenes' Oration on the Crown. As the first public lecturer, she brought to mind the story of Hortensia, who had given an important speech in Rome arguing about whether women should be required to pay taxes at a moment 10 years after the Revolution, when that had been the basis for the right of representation. Eliza Harriot, in the newspapers that summer, explained her purpose. Herself, the lady lecturer, was the example that in the United States, the ladies are found in the society of the sages of the other sex and would soon command the honors due to the professors of science. The toilette and the drawing room, the two traditional venues for women, would be deserted for the forum and the college. She predicted that women, through seeing female examples, would join the forum and college. There are over 140 ads and commentaries about her in the summer of 1787 alone. and Washington's presence at her May 18th lecture, which she managed by stalling one day so he could actually attend, led to accounts of her lecture going viral and being reprinted across the United States in newspapers. Now, that was not all she wanted. She had an ambitious plan for what we would think of as a female college, an academy of belles lettres with a governing board, half women, half men, run by Democratic majority voting, with a woman who led it, one extra woman, actually able to assert control. That woman who would lead the academy was to give public lectures to 300 people once a week. She explained the exertions of a female, herself, would be an example to be imitated and improved on. And it is this plan that she sent to Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sarah. Now, I believe that Eliza Harriot's lectures and her proposal for this ambitious female academy, her prediction that women would be in the college and the forum, influenced the Constitution's stylistic phrasing of offices. If we look at state constitutions written prior to 1787, there was no uniform way to describe who should politically participate. Many political constitutions use neutral language, person or inhabitant, or generic terms like he in 18th century linguistics. Only a very small number used the word male. The initial drafts of the Constitution contained gender-specific language. Congress was to be two separate and distinct bodies of men. The pernicious 3/5 clause explicitly referenced inhabitants of every sex. And most importantly, the draft fugitive slave clause emphasized that men and women, he or she, escaping to a free state, would be returned to slavery. This is a testament to black women's agency, and we think later of someone like Oni Judge who would escape from George Washington, that the drafter who proposed that language could not imagine a person escaping without thinking of women. It is the only use of she in all of the drafting materials relating to the convention. But the final drafting committee removed every gendered reference. And these changes created a neutral constitution with a person, he pattern. Persons referred to inhabitants of every sex, and he was a generic pronoun. And we know this because the interstate rendition clause is written this way, and otherwise all of us in the room who are women can escape all crimes across state lines free. Never once does the word male appear. And so the text of the Constitution left open and unanswered what would be the relationship of women to the constitutional state. It left itself open to the possibility of female genius. But for some, female genius proved threatening. Enter Benjamin Rush, and apologies for giving this talk here. He had a remarkable, capacious mind. He was anti-slavery. He was involved in numerous reformist enterprises. He had married Julia Stockton when she was 17, and they had 13 children. And he served on the all-male board of a newly reorganized female school, the Young Ladies Academy. The men wanted to reform female education so long as they were in charge. And in late July of the summer of 1787, as Eliza Harriot circulated her proposals, Rush gave a widely reprinted speech, Thoughts Upon Female Education. It was designed to destroy Eliza Harriot and Eliza Harriot's plan. Rush gave the old female inferiority argument a new American twist, what historians have since come to call Republican motherhood. Gentlemen should direct female education. British ideas were un-American. French should not be taught. Young ladies should be educated, Rush argued, to be an agreeable companion for a sensible man, and the daughter or wife of an American citizen. And Eliza Harriot, with her Irish Catholic last name O'Connor, was clearly in his sights. At the Young Ladies' Academies, lest the young girls forget, the notebooks reminded the girls of the limited ambition on the cover. The end of a good education is not that you become a dancer, singer, player, or painter. Its real object is to make you a good daughter, a good wife, a good mistress. Now, Rush's opposition doomed Eliza Harriot's academy, and she moved to Baltimore, where her tickets to her lectures there were sold by Mary Catherine Goddard, the first person to print the Declaration of Independence with the signers' names and her own. And then to Alexandria, where George Washington supported her school and invited her to Mount Vernon. And then to Charleston in 1790, where she founded an ambitious academy offering sciences, astronomy, and geography, and may have again crossed paths with Washington when he came south on the Southern tour. And Eliza Harriot was not alone in her views that women were equal to men and that female education and public speaking was political. In 1787, the far more famous Mary Wollstonecraft published Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. And that same year, the constitutional historian Catherine Macaulay began her work on education, assuming female equality. In 1789, Wollstonecraft would publish under a pseudonym The Female Reader, designed to help women learn public oratory. And oratory became a device to allow young women to invade public spaces. The United States would positively receive her Rights of Women in 1792, and the image shows the Philadelphia Ladies magazine, Volume 1, with liberty being presented with Wollstonecraft's Rights of Women. It is in that text that she writes, "I may excite laughter by dropping a hint, for I really think that women ought to have representatives, instead of being arbitrarily governed without any direct share allowed to them in the deliberation of government." Now, exclusion of women from voting was a custom, unjust and detrimental, as a widely reprinted newspaper comment argued. It was not yet a constitutional bar. Women, the editorialist said, were equal to the males, and they should not be obliged to submit to laws they had no share of making. Indeed, the custom did not exist everywhere. Women and people of color voted in New Jersey under a state constitution that said inhabitants could vote if they were worth 50 pounds. In 1790, legislation explicitly used he or she to describe who was able to vote, and 7 years later referred to his or her ballot. And extant poll lists show many women voters and some people of color. In 1793, at the Young Ladies Academy, Priscilla Mason, who could have heard Eliza Harriot 6 years earlier, gave a now famous speech. Mason protested the limits on women. "Supposing we are possessed of all the talents of the orator in the highest perfection, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, and the Senate are shut against them. Who shut them? Man. Despotic man first made us incapable of the duty and forbid us the exercise. Let us, by suitable education, qualify ourselves for those high departments, and they will open before us." The trajectory was clear. Education, public speaking, Senate, and the bar would open. But this vision and Eliza Harriot's collapsed. In 1792, a financial crisis rocked the United States, and Eliza Harriot's husband brought her down with him, and she was forced to flee her school, fleeing debts. She moved to Columbia, where she started another female seminary devoted to what she called improving the female mind. She would die, however, in 1811, a boarder in someone's house. But even there, she tried to exert control over her property, writing a will, signing her name, giving away her books. Now, what Rosemary Zagari has called a backlash, or this morning referred to a pushback, arose against women's inclusion in the constitutional state. The new genre of the written Constitution turned out to be very good at converting custom to sticky constitutional law. And so as states entered the Union, voter requirements shifted. In 1792, Kentucky broadened suffrage for white men, permitting men to vote without property or tax-paying requirements, but by now describing voters as free male citizens. In 1802, this new model grew dominant. Every new state between 1802 and 1876 to enter the Union defined suffrage by constitutional exclusion. The laws began free or white, and after 1820, almost always white. And they ended person, inhabitant, citizen. But what began never to vary was the word male. Indeed, in 1807, New Jersey reversed course, passing a law to limit voting to free white male citizens. By the 19th century, greater participation in government had occurred, but at a great cost. People of color and women now found themselves constitutionally excluded. What I think is that historians who used to call this the rise of democracy in the 1820s, well, it doesn't look very much like democracy. So what, I'm one slide behind. Whoops, there's that slide, sorry. Whoa. Sorry, this always happens at the dramatic conclusion. Well, I'm gonna need someone to get me to the slide because I only have forward and back control. That one, yep, thank you. Okay, ready for the dramatic conclusion? Okay, this is the slide that I lost track of. What influence did Eliza Harriot have? Well, she believed in presenting examples to be imitated and improved on. And we see examples following the path that Eliza Harriot tried to open. Here in Philadelphia, black women rights activists like the Fortin sisters were educated, became public lecturers, were teachers. The first woman to vote under unrestricted suffrage was Utah school teacher Sarah Jones in 1870. The first black woman to register in 1871 was also a school teacher, Mary Ann Shadd Cary. In the place that Eliza Harriot died, in Columbia, in 1869, the South Carolina legislature invited any lady to give a speech on women's rights to vote. One woman accepted, Charlotte Rollins, South Carolina-born black woman, fluent in French and belles letters. Her speech argued for black women and all women to claim the franchise. She argued it was a fundamental and constitutional right belonging to humanity in general. The New York Times covered her speech but mocked it and mocked her argument that women had a right to vote because the Constitution did not include the word male. In May 1787, George Washington heard Eliza Harriot deliver a lecture on the power of being an example. And she provided an example of female genius, and the Constitution was at least stylistically framed consistent with that theory. But her example also inspired opposition, and gradually the new written constitutional state transformed to become defined by exclusion. But who knows what ripples went forth from her lectures, her schools, her numerous newspaper ads. And as a path towards the college and the forum, I think her performance was certainly more than tolerable. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I want to remind everybody that Dr. Bilder is going to be signing copies of Female Genius in the Fells Room after the talk. So you can go get a copy and read more. We now have time for questions.
Oh, okay.
Yes, dear.
Ted Steinbach from Louisville. Did she, in addition to these newspaper accounts and ads, did she ever publish anything in print?
Yeah, it would be wonderful, and she's a great example of the difficulties in working with people who weren't part of places like this that kept their papers. I wrote a book on James Madison, right, and we have almost everything James Madison ever wrote. We have far fewer things on people who, for reasons like they're women or people of color or people who don't have economic resources, didn't keep their papers. She had no children, so and her husband dies, so she actually has no house to keep things in, and her speeches were not published, so it's mostly through newspaper ads. And we can contrast that with Charlotte Rollins. So Charlotte Rollins' speech had not been known. There's 3 copies in Canada of it, and even the people who wrote the women's suffrage accounts in the 19th century left it out. And I was just extremely lucky that Charlotte Rollins somehow managed, this is 1869, to get her speech published in her own little pamphlet. And so we know that what the New York Times said about it wasn't accurate, but otherwise we'd be just left with that. It's just that she managed to get her 4-page speech written down, and that survives actually in Canada in a library.
microphone.
Rich Schifrin, Indiana. I can't help wondering what you think of the proposal of our previous speaker that we separate social justice from other academic concerns, because that might be taken to mean that we should not, in any level of our schooling, teach equality of women.
I don't want to offer any opinion about what a prior speaker would say or not say or be understood as saying. I do think that one of the things that, I work mostly on constitutional history and on what I think of traditional political history, and in working on this book in particular and on education in this period, I think I became more convinced than I ever had that this generation, the framing, founding generation, believed that education was a political right, and it was a political right because education has such possibility to shape who we are as a democratic country. So I think I'll just leave it at that, but I would find a hard time teaching about this without teaching about women. I suppose Eliza Harriot would say you have to X out all the men also, and then I'm not quite sure how we talk.
Hi. As Mary knows, I've read this book, and I can tell everyone it's a wonderful read, and you should all buy it and have her autograph it. It's an amazing job of research. It's very, very impressive. And I thoroughly agree with the point about the importance of education for the founding generation. That is, the importance of education for the founding generation. I would make a slight comment that, in fact, there were people in England at the end of the 17th century who also were promoting women's education, not necessarily women voting, but I've been spending a lot of time lately reading that material, and that's also important. So that's all sort of a preface. But what I really want to ask you about is Catherine Macaulay. I think it's fabulous that you're going to work on Catherine Macaulay, and can you talk a little bit about your next project?
Yeah. I'm going to write on Catherine Macaulay, who I discovered in writing about this book. She was wildly famous, even though everyone's like, well, I didn't hear about her. But I was like, yeah, that's true of a lot of people who are wildly famous. She was the first constitutional historian and wrote a very significant 4-volume at the time history of England that was incredibly popular among the framing generation. And she argued for the justice and patriotic duty of the regicides, because she believed that monarchical government was inherently tyrannical and that we should have a democratic government. And she was very influential on many people in this period. People like Thomas Jefferson thought she wrote wonderful history. John Adams, James Otis, Benjamin Rush wrote her a fan letter, and then she agreed to publish it as a way to boost her American audience. She's a very interesting person, and one of the probably most famous people other than John Wilkes in this generation. And so, and there's been wonderful work on her, particularly by women's historians. Already she was a good friend and correspondent by mail of Mercy Otis Warren, who was the first, arguably, American historian, female historian. So I'm looking forward to that.